Can you accept any peace deal that is cut without Ukraine?
No.
And do you feel like you have a seat at the table right now?
I not only count on it, I'm sure that we have to be there, otherwise it's not acceptable. But if there is a decision without us, and Putin will go out from all our land, we will be in NATO, and Putin will be in the prison, so President Trump can do it without us.
Okay, well, that was a little bit odd there. There was Volodymyr Zelensky on U.S. television basically telling Trump, look, I don't care what you're thinking about. I don't care what you want. I'm going to be at this table, and you're going to be listening to me. And wow, I mean, Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat vet, welcome back to the show. But, man, what do you make of that, Zelensky being so bold and open on U.S. television to Trump?
Well, first of all, Trump's made all the right decisions thus far. Great states do what they can. Small states do what they must. Ukraine is in the way at this point, obstructing the normalization of relations between the United States and Russia. President Trump wants to normalize those relations, which is the right thing to do. We should have done it a long time ago. And as a result, this man Zelensky, who is frankly no longer viewed in the world as legitimate because he suspended elections, is really a non-entity at this point. And Ukraine's fate is going to be decided by great powers. And I mean Russia and the United States, and ultimately Europe. Europeans will have a role. There's no question about that. But the main decision makers have already said, we're going to normalize relations. That's a good way to begin the whole process of ending the war.
And, you know, and I at first, really, there was, especially after the Munich Security Conference, a lot of the conference statements made by Vice President Vance, General Kellogg, and a number of others, Mike Waltz. A lot of heads were blowing up in Europe because and this puzzles me, and I'd like you to talk about this first, because in my view, the statements made by Zelensky, and we're going to have some others from him on this show today, are just completely divorced from reality. And I was thinking, why would anybody want to base anything on him, on his ability to produce anything positive outcome? But yet you had Europe that would seem just think that somehow it was still Joe Biden in the White House, that everything that had been going on for the last 3 years would continue going on under Trump, even though everything in the world from the Trump side from the election forward should have made everything in Munich not surprising in the least, but instead they were shocked. How do you suppose that is from the European side?
Ukraine, in many ways, is a metaphor for globalism. And the war waged by us via Ukraine, and along with the Europeans that contributed to it, was really designed to bring down Russia, which was seen as a bulwark against globalism. After all, Russia is a Russian Orthodox Christian country. It is a powerful cultural foundation. There is such a thing as a Russian, and there is no apologies for it. There are people who are not Russians inside the Russian Federation. They are treated with great care and with absolute equality before the law, as we've seen with the Chechens, for instance, who have proven to be extraordinarily effective as soldiers on the battlefield fighting for the Russian Federation. So I think they were trying to harm Russia in the hopes that this would somehow or another strengthen and propel globalism into the future. The truth is that globalism means no borders. Globalism means no national identities. Globalism means world government that robs sovereign states of the rights to make their own decisions. President Trump wants nothing to do with it. Look what he's done with the World Health Organization. He's made all the right moves internally, without question. And this is another manifestation of his opposition to that globalism, which has been a catalyst for war between us and Russia unnecessarily. When Trump says, if I had been president, this wouldn't have happened, I think, as Lavrov put it, he's probably right. Unfortunately, he wasn't there. But the good news is he is now, and that's going to end. We are going to normalize relations with Russia. So frankly, whatever Zelensky says is irrelevant.
And that's the way it's looking out. Although there's many in the West and so far that talk about heads blowing up when you see their reaction to any attempt to sideline Zelensky, that there seems to be this knee-jerk reaction both in Europe and even in the Western media, the United States media, that, how dare you just ignore Zelensky? Now, I think a lot of that is because, number one, I don't think they understand what's really been going on. But number two, I think that they think that Zelensky is actually a rational actor and in charge of his country. And, we held him up as being a new figure of, historic and heroic proportions and all that stuff. And then now that it's hard to see, well, why would we take the hero and set him aside? What do you say to those people who say it's wrong for the U.S. to sideline Zelensky?
Well, keep in mind that you're right. Zelensky also represented transgenderism, LGBTQ on steroids, the destruction of religion, the elimination of the original Orthodox Christian church in the country, the suppression of any dissent, widespread censorship. All of these things were celebrated by the elites in Europe who are now angry that they have been excluded. Well, those people are all on borrowed time. Let's face it, the nationalist wave is sweeping Europe. All of those governments that have been in the forefront of pushing this insanity, the British, the German, and the French governments, all of these are going to change. They're all on borrowed time. And the other thing is they're all in financial and economic trouble, much as we are. The good news is the Russians are aware of that, but have chosen not to exploit it. And the good news is that President Trump is doing what needs to be done, which is to shed these burdens as he begins to focus more and more on what happens here at home. So I think the other problem is that people are suffering in the population, some of them from cognitive dissonance. In other words, you're being lied to for years that something is true, which isn't. That Ukraine is good, Ukraine is democratic, Ukraine is fighting a noble war against the evil Russians who want to conquer all of Europe. It's all nonsense. It's all wrong. Now, lots of people are saying, well, you mean the BBC was lying? You mean Westdeutscher Rundfunk is lying? Bild lied. I mean, you just go down the list. All these papers and all these television stations have not been telling the truth. Yeah, that's right. I would love to see a demand for real accountability, because all these people are fugitives from accountability. Because remember, you look at the British, for instance, they're very close to going under financially. We can't even be sure that the gold that is supposedly under the streets of London is really there. I suspect a lot of it isn't. By the way, I think we're going to discover something similar in the United States. None of that is Donald Trump's fault, but all of this has happened over the last several decades. And I think when that happens, there are going to be a lot of angry people because the economies are going to collapse. We've already seen the beginning of that in Germany. And when you can no longer subsidize large numbers of people who are foreigners inside your country, which is what the Germans have had to do, and the French and the British, it's going to get ugly. I mean, they're headed into stormy waters. By the way, so are we. I think we're a little bit behind them, but we'll follow. And that's going to be very tough on the president. He's going to have a hard time because Americans frequently blame whoever happens to be in power for everything. And most of that is not his fault at all.
Right. And, I think that a lot of people see those financial storm clouds on the horizon. And every time you have a financial storm, you almost always have, potential for civil unrest in the various countries. And I think that reading between the lines and talking to some of the folks on the Trump team, I think that he is more aware of that than a lot of people think, which I think is part of the impetus of wanting to get this war off the table and all the connections to it off. And in fact, earlier today, there was a 4.5 hour conversation between the United States and Russia, led by Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. After the conversation, or after their meetings, Rubio, Waltz, and one other official had a conversation, and two of the two spoke on camera.
This needs to be a permanent end to the war and not a temporary end as we've seen in the past. We know just the practical reality is that there is going to be some discussion of territory
And so the only thing President Trump's trying to do is bring about peace. It's what he campaigned on. It's something the world should be thanking President Trump for doing. I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process to determine how and how quickly and through what mechanism can an end be brought to this war.
Now, I was also encouraged that after this meeting, the Russian media and some of the official government outlets for the Russian side also spoke very positively about this negotiations, because I think both delegations are trying to look beyond the Russia-Ukraine war to see the great power relations going on after that. And both sides seem to be intent on improving that, which would be a benefit for the United States.
President Trump has decided to normalize relations with Russia. That's what resulted from the meeting in Riyadh. God bless him. It's about time. It's long overdue. That's the key point. We are not going to settle the Ukraine matter quickly. That's going to take time. We are not going to build in isolation some new security architecture for Europe. That's going to have to involve the Europeans, the Russians, and the Americans. But he set us on the right path. The problem in the United States and the West in general is that there is little patience. I think people expected, this meeting would end and the sky would open up and the sun would shine and we'd all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And I have a feeling that some people will express disappointment. But the truth is, President Trump, as we know, and this was true back in 2017, 18, 19, and 20, wanted a normalization of relations with Russia. He was impeded, obstructed by the Washington community that saw benefit to themselves financially and politically to push war with Russia. That has all failed. And that's about time that we turn things around. Thank God President Trump is doing that. On the other hand, the ultimate outcome of all of this is not going to quite be what we would like necessarily, or even the Europeans. And that's simply because the facts on the ground with the Russians will determine what the outcome looks like. The other thing is that eventually people are going to attack Trump because of NATO and EU saying that he caused their dissolution. No, he didn't. If anything, I think you've got to argue that the dissolution of the EU has been in progress for some time. Europeans themselves are miserable. They don't like it. They want to govern themselves. They don't want to be governed from Brussels. And economically, it's been a catastrophe. And as far as NATO is concerned, that thing is dead man walking and has been for a long time. As you and I both know, it was dead man walking when I was there in 97, 98, and 99 in Europe. It takes a long time for these things sometimes to expire. None of that is Donald Trump's fault. But he's taking the right steps that are good for us, and ultimately, I argue, will be very good for Europe. But they won't be good for Europe until they get rid of the people that are ruling them right now, and they will be gone soon.
And you talk about some of the impediments to this, and even the title of our show today is Zelensky is obstructing peace and actually getting in the way of some of this. This is him on U.S. television trying to make the case that, well, he deserves to be on the table.
Have you been given any assurances that Ukraine will have an equal seat at the negotiating table?
So I will never accept any decisions between the United States and Russia about Ukraine. Never. And our people, never. And our adults and children and everybody. It can't be so. This is the war in Ukraine against us, and it's our human losses. And we are thankful for all the support, unity between in USA around Ukraine support, bipartisan unity, bipartisan support. We're thankful for all of this, but there is no any leader in the world who can really make a deal with Putin without us, about us.
So he said, I will not permit it. Does he have the power to permit or not permit anything here?
No. Again, he is a sort of King Lear raging against the storm in Shakespeare's famous play. He's irrelevant. He has no influence at all. And I think he stands an excellent chance of ending up like Mussolini or any number of authoritarian dictators like him that have violated people's rights and led their country to disaster. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it. I'd be more concerned about President Trump's safety because, you've got a lot of Ukrainians, especially the Ukrainian SBU, the security forces, they're operating in certainly in Northern Virginia. I worry about that. That's a real danger, and I hope that we'll crack down on that, because the CIA, as you know, has played a big role in the big lie, in spinning the false narratives and pushing this disastrous war. So I think Mr. Ratcliffe should get some marching orders from Donald Trump to clean that nest out, because if you don't, they'll continue to subvert and undermine what we're trying to do, which again is normalization with Russia. That's number one. Once that is accomplished, and it's going to take some time, but it will work, the rest of these things will fall into place. And our friend Zelensky is not going to be around. He'll be gone somewhere else, trying to live on his ill-gotten gains. I imagine Elon Musk would have a field day tracking down, doing some forensic accounting and finding all the billions of dollars he and his friends have stolen from us.
Well, and in fact, that apparently is going on right now. I don't know whether it's Elon, but certainly from the U.S., where the Treasury Secretary went to Kyiv, and from what I'm reading on some of the Ukrainian Telegram channels, that they're scared to death that part of the deal was we're going to do some audits to find out where this stuff went, and if the stuff comes to light about any malfeasance that may or may not have happened, it could be really problematic for the Ukrainian leader. Now, also at that same conference where Rubio was this morning, he was asked the issue about, will Zelensky be at the table? Does he deserve to be there? At the moment, he said, well, he's not really sidelining anybody, but...
No one is being sidelined here, but President Trump is in a position that he campaigned on to initiate a process that could bring about an end to this conflict. And from that could emerge some very positive things for the United States, for Europe, for Ukraine, for the world. But first, it begins by the end of this conflict. And so the only thing President Trump's trying to do is bring about peace.
So I think you can see there, yeah, we're not sidelining anybody, but we're sidelining him because we're worried about the United States, Europe, and even Russia moving forward, because those are the things that are going to matter. So how do you think, and I'm asking you, I guess, to speculate here, but how do you think that the U.S. is going to not sideline, but sideline Zelensky as these things go to whatever the next level is?
Well, before we move on, the third person that was sitting in that picture is Mr. Witkoff, who is another Wall Streeter and a very wealthy man, but a close confidant of Trump. And I must say, my impression is that most of what's positive that's happening right now in U.S. foreign policy, at any rate, is really a product of Mr. Witkoff. He has Trump's ear. Trump trusts him. And I'm sorry he didn't speak, but that's understandable given the circumstances. But I think he's exerting a very positive influence. I hope he can do that in the Middle East, because I think the Middle East is still an entirely different set of circumstances. It's, as you and I used to say, it's a barrel of eels. And I don't know that Mr. Witkoff can sort that one out, but he's done great work. So I think that's good news. On the other hand, I think all this business about Zelensky is irrelevant. He's kept alive and kept in power by the CIA and MI6. Remove that element, and I don't think he'll be around long. I don't know where he's going to go if he leaves Ukraine and be safe.
Yeah, that's a real issue. Many of the guests on our show have voiced concerns over his future safety, even maybe before this thing gets to an end. But we'll leave that one there for now. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier in this show about the consequences and what things that do matter. If Zelensky is an impediment to peace, what is going to matter? And you specifically said the United States is going to act based on realities on the ground. Well, the other actor that's going to base their reactions on the realities on the ground is the Russian side. Now, here is one of the things that Sergei Lavrov said about what is going to animate their view going forward to actually reach a settlement.
Что касается итогов Мюнхенской конференции, могу сказать следующее. Каждый должен отвечать за свои поступки. И когда кто-то долгие годы творит беззаконие, нарушает свои собственные продекларированные когда-то правила равноправия, честной конкуренции, презумпции невиновности, неприкосновенности собственности, свободы выражения мнений, обеспечение свободы доступа к информации, когда все это растаптывается без зазрения совести, когда грабится чужое в нарушении всех норм международного права, когда поощряется нацистский режим, и когда такой нацистский режим накачивается вооружениями для того, чтобы убивать своих собственных граждан, и это все делается в расчете на то, что как-нибудь проскочим и отсидимся под ядерным зонтиком, так уже не будет. И за свои деяния надо отвечать.
Now, he listed a whole lot of things in there about some grievances that they hadn't really. A lot of them were some that you'd mentioned earlier before about, and I'm sure he was referring indirectly to Zelensky in one part because he said, you know, the freedom of religion has been violated, freedom of speech has been violated, international laws, and people have been robbed, i.e., a lot of this money that's being given to Ukraine is going from Russia has been given to Ukraine. But it was also more than that, because he's basically saying that the West up to this point had been culpable in enabling that kind of thing. And he says that's not going to happen anymore. Here's the big question. Is this a negotiation between equals to where Russia is going to have to give something to get something, or do the conditions on the ground make it to where they can just set the conditions?
Of course, neither you nor I were present for this meeting, and we don't know what President Trump says in the Oval Office. But I think President Trump is a realist, and he understands that this is a war that the Russians have won. Their cause was from the beginning just, and they deserve to be reassured about their future security, which means we need a truly neutral Ukraine. I've often talked about the Austrian model, as others have, and I still think that's an excellent model. I think that's possible. It's not going to work with Zelensky or any of his neo-Nazi pals. And, you know, this whole Nazi thing was always a terrible thing to do because you dredged up old memories. You opened up old wounds. I mean, the Ukrainians suffered terribly under communism and they hated them. They didn't just wake up in the morning and said, we're going to support the Germans in their crusade against Bolshevism. They and virtually everybody in Eastern Europe swung in that direction because nobody wanted to live under Stalin. Well, that ended. It ended badly for us. It ended badly for them. But that's water under the bridge. That old Stalinist regime is gone, has nothing in common with Russia today. Russia's an entirely different state. And the Russians, unfortunately, had to put up with this and saw how much hatred could be mobilized against them. And they want to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. You can never be 100% certain, but we have to listen to them on that score. They deserve some sort of security guarantee. I think the Austrian solution will provide it. But for the Austrian solution to work there, you have to have the Europeans on side. They've got to sign up for it. I think that's possible. The longer we wait, if we try to rush this deal, people like Starmer, who won't be there too much longer, are going to obstruct you because they're globalists. For them, Ukraine's a metaphor for globalism, and anything they do to promote globalism, this destructive force, is justified morally. So they've got to go away. So the longer this takes to ultimately settle matters on the ground, from my standpoint, is fine. And I don't think we should rush it. I think it should be done very deliberately. And then a new security architecture for Europe can emerge. I hope somebody in the Trump administration has hauled out the original proposals that were presented by the Russians in December 2021. They wouldn't even look at them. Biden essentially threw them on the trash heap. We need to pull those out. And that will give us an appreciation for what the Russians wanted then, which from my standpoint was not unreasonable at all. But then again, I did not look at Russia as this vicious, evil, subversive entity that had to be treated like a crocodile in the living room. So I think Trump's got more sense about all of this. The only reservation I have is who's he going to pick to do those things? Because there are a lot of people that are swimming around his administration who leave a lot to be desired on this score. And remember, some of these people have now had what would you call them? Damascus conversions. I think Rubio is a good example. Huge warmonger, pouring vile all over the Russians in the past. Waltz is another one. Okay, they've obviously had a come to Jesus moment with Trump. That's good. But if you're going to sit down with the Russians and work through the details, you better get some people in there that don't fall into that category. I think it was very wise to leave Kellogg out of the picture. I'm sorry to know that they want to involve him with the Ukrainians because he's, I think, compromised on that side. But that's a matter for the president to decide. But ultimately, the Ukrainians are going to be told to shut up and color. They lost. It's our fault as well as theirs. We share that, but it's over. And they've got to do what we tell them to do. And if they don't, they will pay a higher price.
Now, let me ask you. So you said from your perspective, if this takes a while, that's fine. We don't need to rush into it for the reasons you mentioned. That's on the diplomatic and even political front. But the potential problem with that is on the military front, because the troops on the ground, and this is something I'd like you to talk about here, because there's some real risks and dangers from the Ukraine side that their army may end up collapsing because the pressure that the Russia has been putting even so far continues to move to the west. But I just wonder what you're really good at history and you understand how a lot of things have worked over centuries. Mm-hmm. From the perspective of the Ukrainian troops, they have been losing constantly like this. And now that they see that their leader is being sidelined and the future of how this is going to come out is going basically between Moscow and Washington. How much longer do you think they'll continue to fight ferociously and risk their lives just to decide whether the end is going to be here or it's going to be here?
Note that the Russians made it very clear that there would be no ceasefire. Excuse me. And the reason for that is very clear. What you've said, there are still elements fighting. And until they're satisfied that they have eradicated the radical elements that are responsible for keeping this war going, the Russians are not willing to stop because they have no certainty, no confidence that these criminal elements, as he puts it, these neo-Nazis and others, if they are allowed to live and escape, will not come back again. And that's a legitimate concern. So there will be no ceasefire until the Russians are convinced that there is no longer any resistance. Secondly, we can accelerate this if we want to and simply suspend any more support or aid in any kind to the Ukrainians. And clearly, if you're right, and we're going to look, if it's Besament or it's Musk or anybody is going to look at the enormous loss of money in that place, into that black pit called Ukraine, then I think President Trump will be inclined to stop it immediately because, President Trump is a businessman. You don't reinforce failure. You don't invest in something it's a dead end. So I think that'll happen. That needs to happen, by the way. Then the last part is we really need to get out of Ukraine. And when I say that, I'm talking about the CIA, the U.S. military, U.S. military advisors. We need to all pack it up and leave. At that point, I think if those two things happen, everything else will fall into place. Now, somebody will say, well, we have to stay there as leverage. That's not leverage. We have no leverage. Who are we kidding? What's to stop them? This reminds me, people have been talking about Yalta, which I think, was frankly a disaster for Western civilization, but there's nothing we could have done because from the very beginning, Stalin made it clear that the facts would be determined on the ground and that each side would establish its social system to the limit of advance. And that meant basically if we advance over the dead bodies of Poland and Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and into Germany, well, then we own it. It's ours. We're not really dealing with that right now because the Russians aren't foolish. They don't want to occupy it, but they do have a number of Ukrainians, real Ukrainians living in Russia. And these Ukrainians are available to go over there and make a difference, make an impact. But it's important for us to be out of the picture if that's going to happen, because as long as we're there, we're seen as the sort of sponsors for Zelensky and his group. And that group absolutely must go away.
So let me ask y'all for the moment, just on the military perspective, can the Ukraine army as it currently sits, can it continue to fight effectively until all the negotiations get worked out?
Well, effectively, no, but it can continue to fight. In other words, people can continue to stage insurgent warfare against the Russians, as long as you continue to sustain them with cash and weaponry. You can still send over, MLRS rockets, and you can still roll out the MLRS and shoot into Russia. This is another reason why I want to stop it, because I don't think we should have anything to do, should never have had anything to do with anything designed to kill Russians in Russia. In fact, I was one of the people early on that said, people like Lindsey Graham or Romney, others that were celebrating the deaths of Russians were idiots, and they should be censured for saying such stupid things. We need to get out of that mindset 100%. So my view is we should just cut it off, because that means Russian lives are now at less risk. When that's clear that there is no longer any support, the vast majority of Ukrainians that are still in uniform fighting will stop. There will be some hardcore holdouts. There always are. We even found that in Germany towards the end of the war, and we rounded them up and shot them. And that put an end to it. But they were less than 1%. The overwhelming majority of German soldiers were happy to go home. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainians will be happy to go home. So I think that's true. And I think it will happen. So the sooner we end this aid, that'll really end killing.
Yeah.
And that's really what I think President Trump wants to do.
Yeah, it is. And that's whatever's going to get to the end the fastest, so we can get on to the rest of living and security architectures that will keep everybody safe, Russians, Europeans, and Americans. That's really the objective here. But one of the roadblocks to that, you mentioned this a minute ago, is the globalist mindset. And we were talking about some of the Europeans, but some of those are on the American side, and one of which is somebody you may have heard from, a guy named David Petraeus, has this little gem of what he suggests the White House should do next.
There has to be a security guarantee. I can't imagine that Ukraine could agree to anything that did not include a robust security guarantee. The question is, what could be in it? Just beyond a military response, could it include, for example, automatic seizure of the $300 billion of Russian assets sitting in European banks? Could it include an automatic path to NATO membership for Ukraine? All of this in addition to whatever the military action might be taken by probably a coalition of the willing. In an ideal world, it would be a NATO operation led by an American three-star, let's say, with a core headquarters that is then built into a NATO coalition headquarters with lots of European and U.S. assets.
Okay, that was I couldn't. I had to watch the video a second time before we decided to put it on here to see if I heard it right. Here he is. Petraeus is saying, in an ideal condition, in the best case, it's going to be a U.S. NATO core operation with the U.S. military three-star in charge of this, tied back to Brussels. What planet is he on again?
Well, he's trying to breathe life into the comatose body of NATO, first of all. Let's keep that in mind. Secondly, the empire, those imperial advocates on the Hill will love this, because anything they can do to maintain our presence in Europe over the long term is a feeding opportunity at the public trough. More money is then washed through the system and ends up in their pockets. All the think tanks in Washington would welcome all of this. I mean, what are you going to do at the Atlantic Council pretty soon? I don't see much future for it. They're not happy. So the Atlantic Council goes out of business. What's the Brookings Institute going to do? They love to sit around and fantasize about all these kinds of peacekeeping operations and, permanent intrusive headquarters that are going to somehow dictate and nation build and all this nonsense. I think he's out of touch with reality, but then I've thought that for a long time.
And as you see there, Gary showing that headline there, Lavrov said no European troops, absolutely no chance that they'll be completely unacceptable. And I want to get back to this point, because many will say, well, that's just part of negotiations. They have to give on something, and our side has to give on something, but we'll come kind of in the middle. But as you see the power dynamics play it out here, Doug, does the Russian side have to give in on this, or can they just keep fighting until they take it all by force?
They can do the latter, but they don't want to. And if you listen carefully to what President Putin has said, He's talked about the oblasts that are occupied now by the Russians that have Russian populations. He's also interested in Kherson and Zaporozhye, if for no other reason as a matter of security. I still think that the Russians will want Kharkov because Kharkov is very close to Russia. It is historically a Russian-speaking city, and I don't think they want that to fall back into the hands of the Ukrainians for fear of what they might try to do with it. I mean, let's be perfectly blunt. I wrote an op-ed when this whole thing started, and I tried to say that from our standpoint as Americans and NATO, what happened east of the Dnieper River was not a matter of great strategic importance to us. That part of the world east of the Dnieper was historically had little to nothing to do with the West. Everything from Kyiv to the West was ruled for centuries by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and ultimately the Kingdom of Poland. And it was when these institutions, these Polish-Lithuanian alliances fell apart, that the Russians essentially advanced into the vacuum, which of course we would have done as well. The second part that I think we need to understand is if the Mexicans had been organized and equipped and trained by Russians to build a great army to invade Texas, Mexico, and Arizona, and they had gone into these places and killed 100,000 Americans, how would we react to the collapse of that foreign force as it was driven south of the Rio Grande? Would we compromise and say they could have half of Arizona? Or would they demand that, or would we demand that we're going to continue to control everything to the Rio Grande? I think we'd stick with the Rio Grande. So I would be prepared for something more from the Russians than what they currently have. I can't predict it. And I'm sure the Russians will come to the conclusions very carefully. You'll have the general staff on one side, the foreign ministry on the other, and the people in commerce who are worried about future business and so forth. And they will put together something that is for negotiation. Because remember, what the Russians want out of all of this, along with us, is normalization. Remember from the beginning, we've talked about this. I said, Putin wants to do business with the West, not fight it. That's still true. And so under those circumstances, I think there will be give and take, but I can't predict what that will be. But you can't give too much as a Russian on the east side of the Dnieper, because you will be viewed as a traitor. You could be removed from power. The Russian people that have suffered these losses are not going to be open to too much give. So it has to be carefully metered. From our standpoint, it's back to what I said before. What happens east of the Dnieper has never been of importance to us. Never. By the way, when the original Barbarossa invasion plan was developed, the German general staff wanted to advance to that river line and stop. They weren't fools. It was Hitler that drove everybody further east. So, in World War I, if you look at the war between the Germans and the Russians, once again, they stayed well to the west. They weren't interested in these vast open areas. There's nothing militarily or strategically for us to gain by advancing into those areas. So we need to be very flexible, but I think if we are flexible, the Russians will be forgiving in the sense that, remember, we have been pushing this war against them. And if I'm right, then I think you'll see something more reasonable than everything from the Dnieper to the east is Russian. It'll be something other than that. I don't know what it will be.
Yeah, it certainly remains to be seen. Certainly lots. I've been reading in some of the Russian military review and some of the other Telegram channels where there's lots of voices given that if for exactly the reason you said there, that Russia has spent 100,000 of their own troops on this that are dead, about 250,000 or maybe more that are actually wounded as well. And they say they're not going to be satisfied with just freezing the line where it is right now and keeping what they have. They want, the security of there. So, but you're right. There are multiple competing power centers in Russia. It's not just a monolithic kind of dictator like we like to characterize it. So we'll have to see how that plays out here. But one of the last questions I want to ask before we let you go here today is as we talked about at the start, the European side has still been thinking it's just going to be status quo from the Biden era, and they didn't want it to change, and they were, quote, shocked when Trump said some of these things here. But there was a big emergency meeting in Paris yesterday that 8 of the European leaders got together, and they really didn't come out with anything. So apparently there's not even consensus even among those 8. So the question is, once this gets settled, however it ends up getting settled, how effective do you think President Trump is going to be to bring Europe back into line to where there's some sort of unity between the West and the United States?
I think that it would probably be useful, if we haven't planned to do it, for Mr. Witkoff, Mr. Rubio, those two in particular, to fly to Berlin, and from Berlin to Paris, and from Paris to London, and personally brief the people there on what was discussed, what we accomplished, and where we want to go. I think that would help a great deal. So I hope that happens. That's the way you bring on the European side and get them to understand that this normalization between us and Russia is now going to happen. And if President Trump does that, if he pursues this normalization, he lets the Ukraine war settle, stops the funding, pulls us out, and lets this thing sort out on the ground, and does what I just suggested, send Rubio and Mr. Witkoff to Berlin, Paris, and London for discussions. I think that he could end up with a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing peace to Europe. So I hope that will be seriously considered, because that's the way you move forward. You don't want to rush anything. It all has to be deliberate. But let there be no mistake. This is Donald Trump in charge. And let's tell Zelensky to shut up and go away.
Right. And the big fear that so many are painting right now is that this would just be feeding a revanchist Russia, and then they'll roll on to the west of Europe after they conquer here. I think that if what you described happens, I think that they'll all be upset, because Russia won't be rolling to the west, because they won't have any need to. They'll have their security on their borders settled, and certainly hope that's the way it works out, because that would be a massive win for everybody, for the rest of the people who are still alive in Ukraine, and all of the Europeans would all benefit from that, and definitely the United States would. So I certainly hope that that we get to find out if we can go down that path, because that's the best chance for peace, I believe.
Well, I also think it would be good if President Trump or his spokesman would say, as soon as we've normalized these relations, we need to promote travel to the United States for vacation and entertainment and tourism in Russia. And I would say the same thing should be true inside the United States for citizens to go to Russia, spend some time in that country, and see what's happening for tourism and vacationing and so forth. I think one of the great achievements, accidentally, frankly, from the Second World War was to open the borders, in the sense that we made travel between European states easier. And a Frenchman put it to me very well, and I've got many friends in France, and they laughed and they said, "We've told the Germans, please come to France in the future. We're happy to have you, but in the future, bring your wives and children." And I think that's what we need to do. That's important. That's a component of this. And I think President Trump should champion that as well. But that's down the line. But that's the direction we need to go. This all needs to stop. I think it can all work. And I'm very grateful for President Trump's courage, because, it takes a lot of courage to stand up to these maniacs in Washington.
Indeed, yes.
Then, of course, he's going to focus on Northeast Asia. He's going to focus on primarily on the Middle East. I hope he can achieve something similar there, although I think that's going to be a tougher nut to crack.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot more difficult. But in the last few minutes we have here, I actually want to, you mentioned about Asia. There's some issue going on right now with that China wants to bypass some of the Malacca Straits, and there's potential for some additional passageways they have, and apparently it has a lot in the United States unhappy about it. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what's going on there. Gary, if you can toss that map up we have here. This is Thailand there at the top, and this is Malaysia there in the middle, and you see some blue lines there. It looks like there's some possible new canal zones here. What can you tell us about this?
Well, the Chinese as you would expect, are very, very sensitive to American naval power. And they've been through this particular problem in the past. The Royal Navy essentially isolated China, opened it forcibly to the opium trade. And that's something from which China did not recover for many decades. And the Chinese refer to the century of humiliation when the British and the French and other Europeans, Japanese, all essentially treated China, yes, as essentially a source of income, a place to be raped eventually for its resources. So they're very concerned about the disputes in the South China Sea. We've taken the position that whatever they want is wrong. By the way, Taiwan's claims in the South China Sea are exactly the same as the Republic of China's or the Chinese states' claims are right now. They're trying to find a way through without problems. They also look at the Straits of Malacca and they say, well, what if we can't reach some sort of accommodation with the United States? Perhaps we can build an alternate route, because that Strait of Malacca is a bottleneck. If you look at it very carefully, it's a long bottleneck. And the other point is that the Strait of Malacca has more traffic than it can handle. So if the Chinese can build one or two or more additional canals further north, then you cut off this long run all the way around Malaysia, then up through the passage between Malaysia and Indonesia into the Indian Ocean. People are saying, oh, this is for military purposes. No, it's not. It's for commerce. By the way, the Panama Canal has more traffic than it can handle. And that's a good thing. And we should welcome another canal if it can be built across the isthmus as well. This has nothing to do with war. But the Chinese are not fools, and they want peace, and they want to avoid confrontation. How do you do that? You stay out of the South China Sea as much as possible. One way to do it is build these new canals.
Well, we'll have to wait and see how that turns out there, but I appreciate that update. We don't get a lot of information these days because everybody's kind of focused on the Russia-Ukraine war, the Middle East, and understandably so, but we'll continue to keep an eye on that too as things develop. Also, the last thing, if you could tell us a little bit before you get out, understand there's going to be a new show on Macgregor, which is a cool name and a cool image there. Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, I think we're trying to put something together that will incorporate some of the features you saw with Tucker Carlson tonight, as well as some other shows. This will be a little edgier. Obviously, we want to deliver the truth. And as I say, and whenever I speak about it, is we're not going to take any prisoners. We're going to tell the truth. And that means the truth about everything that we find. We're not going to lie about anything. We're not going to pretend that, roses are springing up everywhere and the new world is upon us, because we all know that's not true. There are always good things and bad things that happen. Americans need to know both. So we just want to deliver that kind of information. And I think it'll be entertaining because we'll have some interesting guests, and not all of it will be deadly serious, but some of it is, and it has to be.
Well, that's awesome. We're really looking forward to seeing that, and we'll definitely be tuning in. And really glad to see it. I'm, with major media, kind of really bleeding their viewers everywhere. A lot of the reasons because they don't talk about truth. So this will be a breath of fresh air and adding into the growing number of folks who are doing their own stuff. So we're looking forward to that.
Well, we'll have you on too, Dan.
Look forward to being there too. I hope we get that chance.
Okay.
But thank you so much for coming on today, Doug. This has been a very, very fascinating time and show, especially with so much going on in the world in this Russia, which could have so many implications. If it goes well, it could be great for the United States. And if it's not handled well, could be problematic. So we'll have to see how that goes on. And we'll definitely have you back on as we continue to go down this path. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't before you leave. Also, as a reminder, we're on regular podcasting now. I know a lot of people aren't able to listen on the video all the time, but a lot of them, some of your friends, don't forget to tell them about it. Love podcasts. So go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you get your podcast, and type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you'll find us waiting there for you. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.